until about a year ago, it was really easy for me to talk about rods when people used to ask what rods are you using in what scenarios and why. It was really quite simple because there were only 3 rods really that I was using to cover all of my fishing. For short range work I was using the Slim, or the XS Slim as it used to be known. And I used to use that for silverfish, for skimmers, for bream, but I also used it for F1s, and I also used it for bigger carp as well. And that rod really covered everything for my fishing up to 35 metres. Once I went past that, I then used to use the XC class. It was a rod that was great. Again, I used to use it for bream fishing and carp fishing, and those rods are still out there right now. When I went past that, when I started looking at casting at range, you know, 60 metres plus, I would then switch over to the XD, the horizon rod that most people will all be familiar with. And that was it. I used to be able to do just about all my fishing with those 3 rods. However, now we've got so many different rods in the range, there are literally rods to cover every pocket and every eventuality. It's natural that we've seen a huge increase in questions from people just asking why I have selected the rods that I'm using for the wide range of venues that I'm fortunate enough to be able to fish. And that's what this video is all about. I'm just going to be showing you the key rods that I now use across a wide range of venues. I'm a big believer in having a rod that's going to do several different jobs. You know, the last thing I want to do is carry a dozen rods to cover every single eventuality, when I can probably carry 3 or 4 rods that are still going to allow me to fish those venues and in those scenarios. So that's what this video is all about. Well, I'll start with a short range sort of fishing. A lot of the feeder fishing that we do these days is really within that 30 metre sort of range, whether that be on commercial fisheries or natural venues. Now the rod that I'm using for all that sort of fishing is the Slim. Again, it's the upgraded version. It's incredibly light, compact rod. It's really nice, especially when coupled with a 3000 reel, and I use that for fishing for roach, for skimmers, for bream, and that's really the kind of range and species that I use that rod for now, because when I'm looking at targeting F1s and carp, then I use a different rod for that job now. The Slim, it's just a lovely rod. I only use the 11-foot version, and that's because I'm quite comfortable with that length rod. Now there are lots of people that would like to use a 9-foot rod or a 10-foot rod when they're only casting at short range. However, for me, because the Slim is such a soft rod, it's such a light rod, I'm quite happy using that rod even when we're fishing at ranges much closer than that. I mean, when I was at Tamar, for example, I was fishing 6 metres with a little cage feeder, and I could use the 11-foot Slim for that job. However, I could also use the same rod when I had to go out to 30 metres. So that is the rod that I'm using for all my silverfish fishing at short range. It's a beautiful rod. Like I say, if you couple it with a nice size reel, this is a 3000 horizon that I use, and that is really nice and balanced. It's a lovely compact rod, and that covers all of my silverfish fishing up to about 30 to 35 metres. Now, sticking with that short range theme, the next rod that I use when I'm fishing up to about 40 metres for bigger fish, it's got to be for me the commercial feeder. Again, I only carry the 11-foot for that sort of fishing, and this does that sort of short to mid-range sort of fishing, but with much more backbone. This rod, it's part of the Horizon Pro range, which means it's lovely and light and slim. However, it's got a little bit more power to it, and that's why I use this rod when I'm targeting F1s and when I'm targeting carp into double figures that have now become quite common on some of the commercial fisheries that we're now fishing. Again, because it's only an 11-foot rod, a 3000 reel is ideal on this rod. You could use a 4000 reel. The 4000 isn't too bulky, but I think it's ideally suited and matched to a 3000 reel, because again, because this is an 11-foot rod, you're only casting up to 40 metres, that sort of range. Then a 3000 reel is all you need. You don't need a big casting reel because you're not casting at range. So this is the rod that I use when I'm going on commercials, when I'm targeting carp, F1s. This will tackle fish, and it has done for me carp well into double figures. I've had carp to over 20 pound on this rod now. But this is also a rod that I carry on natural venues. Reservoirs, as we know, can be very prone and susceptible to the weather conditions changing, and this sort of a rod really steps in when the Slim can't handle those windy conditions. So for example, when you're on a reservoir casting 20, 30 metres, 35 metres, when the wind gets up, the Slim might not be able to cope with those severe conditions, and that's where this rod comes in. However, even when the conditions are nice and calm, I can still use this rod in those conditions for silverfish, and that's exactly what I used recently at Tamar Lakes, where we're only catching fish that sort of size, but this has got enough backbone and power in it so that if the conditions do change, you can still reach those ranges with this rod. So if you're going to a venue where you think the weather conditions could change, instead of having a slim setup, a light rod like that, and this rod set up to cover that line if the conditions change, you might find, just like I often do, is that instead of even putting the slim in the bag, if you think the conditions are going to change, just put that rod in. It just means that you've got a rod that's going to do lots of different jobs, and because it's got the extra bit of backbone, that's the reason why I carry this when I go to commercials. Before we move on to the rods that I use when I'm casting further, I think this is an appropriate time to mention the other much more specialised rod that I do carry. Now this rod is a 10-foot version of the feeder rod that I've just shown you. So this is a 10-foot commercial feeder. Now this is something that I've only really adopted in the last probably year, and that's because lots and lots of the competitions that I fish are feeder only competitions. However, when we're fishing commercials mainly, we are often faced with pegs like what I've got here today. We are targeting margins. We're targeting margins for big fish late on in matches, and even though it's a feeder competition, we still need to put our bait where those fish are. Now normally we would tackle those areas with a pole, obviously. However, in feeder competitions you don't have that option, and these areas are way too important to ignore. By their very nature, you're fishing close to snags quite often, and you're fishing for bigger fish. So because of that, that is why I carry this rod when I'm on commercial fisheries in feeder only competitions, and this rod is specifically for targeting the margins. Now the reason why this rod is different, again, it's the commercial feeder like we've just talked about, so it's got plenty of backbone for landing fish well into 20 pound, which this rod has done. It's a lovely light compact rod as well. It's only 10 foot, and that's because we're targeting the margins, so we don't need a long rod. Okay, so you've got a 10-foot rod that's nice and compact. It's got plenty of power in it for those bigger fish. Quite often you're underarming the feeder in, so a 10-foot rod's ideal for doing that. And the other thing as well is, again, it's coupled with a 3000 reel, which is balanced lovely, but this is equipped with 10-pound main line. All right, and that's because quite often when we are targeting margins, you might be going close to platforms, close to features, overhanging trees, reeds, anything like that. There is a lot of abrasion that can go on there when you're putting your feeder down there, and certainly when you're hooking big, hard fighting, powerful fish. So by having a 10-pound main line, it's just a little bit of an insurance policy, just to give you your setup a little bit more durability in case your line or your mono is going to be rubbing against, you know, the legs of platforms and features. It just gives you a much better chance of landing those hard fighting fish, and because you're only underarming this at short range, it doesn't really matter about the diameter of your line. It's not affecting your casting, it's not getting picked up by the toe. Okay, and I couple this with a 1.5 ounce tip, because usually, more often than not, you're fishing the method, and it's obviously a self-hooking way of fishing, and it just gives you a bit more power to land those harder fighting fish. But that is a very specialised bit of kit that I've carried for about a year now, and touch wood, it hasn't let me down yet. Now the final rod that I feel I need to mention to you is a rod that I have found lots and lots of uses for, way more uses than what I originally expected. It's the Horizon Pro Distance. Now this is the 12-foot version. Now if I can get away with a 12-foot rod for casting 50, 60 metres, then I will take that option every time over a 13 or 14-foot rod. It just makes the job much easier, and it makes netting fish much easier as well, as you have got a shorter rod. Now one thing I really do need to mention is that, you know, this rod has got the word distance on it, and I know lots of people like myself originally thought this was an out-and-out distance rod. It isn't. Okay, I thought this was going to be a rod that I would only use for casting 60 meters plus, whether it be with a method feeder or a cage feeder or anything like that, but it's not at all. It's filled in much more of the other jobs that I'd hoped it would do. Now like I said, it's a 12-foot rod, but this is the 90-gram version that I use. This is the main one that I just carry, and I use this when I'm fishing on lakes, on reservoirs, when I'm casting 50 meters plus. It makes the job really easy. You've got to remember to match the tip to it. You know, I do hear people trying to fish with a rod like this, a 12-foot rod, trying to cast 50 metres plus, and they're trying to do it with a 1 ounce tip. You know, when you're fishing at that sort of range, there are so many factors involved that, you know, you're just not gaining anything by trying to do it with a 1 ounce tip. So I use this rod with a minimum of a 2 ounce tip, and to be quite honest with you, it's usually a 2.5 ounce tip that I use in this, and that's because that extra, you know, the 2.5 ounce tip is helping you to get your feeder out there, certainly in severe conditions when the wind's strong. And when the wind is strong like that, inevitably it means that you're going to be getting some sort of tow on the water, whether it be left or right, and that is going to be affecting your tip anyway. You know, if you've got 50 meters of line or braid out there with a tow on it, then that is going to be bending your tip. So again, that's another reason why the 2.5 ounce tip for me has been just about perfect on every scenario. So this is the rod that I carry when I'm going 50 meters plus. I use the same rod when I'm targeting carp as well, or F1s, as well as silverfish like bream and skimmers. So it's a great all-round rod for that. But the other use that I'd never expected or anticipated I'd be able to use this rod for, and that was fishing on the river. So when I fish on the River Trent, for example, you know, it's a medium paced river. You know, it's not a really fast river. This is a beautiful rod for that. The majority of the time when we're fishing on rivers like that, you're not really casting at range. You know, you might be casting at you know, a 30, 40, 50 gram feeder. Sometimes it might be 60 or 70. This is a 90 gram rated rod, so you can easily cast feeders in the 50 to 60 gram bracket if you need to. But like I say, on rivers like that, more often than not, you're not casting at range. But because it's 12 foot, it's long enough to get the line up off the water, to get your rod up in the air like we do on rivers. But because it's 12 foot, it means that even when you are only casting 30 meters, 40 meters, then it's a really nice comfortable rod for doing that. So once again, I was very pleasantly surprised to have a rod that I carry in my bag that can do multiple jobs. I am like most people. If I can get one rod that's going to do multiple jobs, then I think that's great. It's cutting down on the amount of tattle that you're carrying with you, and it's making your rod selection much simpler. We've enough to think about in fishing, trying to get our tactics right and that sort of thing. This just means that your mind's then freed up to not worry about your rods. It's just free to think about your actual fishing, about your game, about your approach, and about getting your tactics right. So I hope this has answered a few of the questions of why I choose these rods for these different jobs. And if you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit subscribe to see more videos from this channel. So thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.